السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. First of all, thank you for taking time out of your Sunday to join this important conversation. And I'm especially talking to those of you in leadership positions, but really this talk can apply to anyone. Every single one of us is a leader in some way. And so what I've tried to do in this talk is to draw out some lessons and some principles from the life of the Prophet ﷺ, because he is, by every measure, by secular and spiritual measures, by historical measures, by every possible measure you can think of, the best leader that has ever lived on the planet Earth, and the best leader that will ever live on the planet Earth. And so we should be studying his life and drawing out gems and lessons for eternity. And these are by no means exhaustive. These are just 10 that I want to share 10 of them that I find resonate the most with me, and I think are hopefully going to be useful to you all as you navigate your leadership roles throughout your life. So to get started, the first one, and this one I think is a really important one, is to approach a leadership position with caution and sincerity. And here's what I mean by that. The Prophet ﷺ, when he was called on to go start da'wah, when you look at the Quran's call to him, it starts out with Ya ayyuhal muzammil, O you who is wrapped up. And the tafsir talks about him being wrapped up in a thick, warm blanket that actually the idea or the belief of the mufassirin is that it was revealed at a time of winter where it was it was cold and people used really thick blankets. The idea is that the first call is addressing a person who is shying away or cautious about the responsibility of leadership, because he understood the gravity of it, the responsibility of it. He didn't look to its glory or to its attention or to its fame or to the legacy he would leave. His first initial response to the call to be the messenger of Allah is with caution. And this is a very important lesson for every single one of us, that we have to approach these roles with sincerity and caution. Now, I want to also say it does not mean that we avoid leadership altogether. We avoid roles where we are serving our community and God. It doesn't mean to avoid them necessarily. It means that we just have to approach them with sincerity and caution. And what that requires is the inner work. If you read in Surah Al-Muzammil, what Allah told the Prophet to do, alayhi salatu wasalam, in preparation for the heavy load that he was going to be encountering in taking this message to the world, is he told him to stand in prayer at night. And it's a very counter message from what we usually hear, which is, you have a hard day tomorrow, so get a good night's sleep, right? Well, the Prophet ﷺ was actually told to do the opposite, to stand in prayer a third of the night or half of the night. And why that's important is because the inner work, the spiritual work that you must do to prepare yourself for a role in public service of any kind is absolutely critical. It is incredibly important that you not neglect your spiritual health. In fact, nothing I think will test you more than a public role or a leadership role. So it is absolutely crucial that you build into your busy schedule a regular wird, a regular practice of the spiritual tradition in our faith. So it's essential that you not only do your salah, your fard, but that you build in some extra ibadah to prepare your heart and prepare your mind for what you're about to go up against. The other thing I would say is essential is to build into your schedule a regular diet of ilm, You absolutely must continue to learn, and from qualified scholars. I would also add that learning in a social setting, meaning a halaqah, this is something I'm a huge believer of. I think a regular weekly halaqah is really essential, especially when you're doing this hard work, because you also need other people. You need the suhbah of other people around you that are going to help you on this journey, that are going to be your mirrors and your reminders and your support. And the Prophet ﷺ himself, even as phenomenally strong as he was, needed those support systems starting from his wife Khadija radiallahu anha. So don't feel like this is something that you're going to do on your own. Don't feel like this is an individual journey. It is not an individual journey. You need other people and they need you. And so seek out that support. Number two, and this really kind of builds from that, is address the powerful with fearless dignity. And here's what I mean by that. We can fall into one of two kind of traps when we're having to deal with people in power, people with authority, as representatives or as public servants of the Muslim community. We can either look to the powerful people with authority, people with, who can impact your school, your life, whatever. And we can see them as wielding all the influence, as having the final, having all the power, and responding to that in a way where we are behaving in a way that is fearful or that is compromising. Or the other trap is to view others who might be, have a different point of view, or even antagonistic towards us as enemies to conquer. And neither is the way of the Prophet ﷺ. If you read the way in the Quran, and the first, think about this, the first reader of the Quran, the first audience of the Quran was the Prophet himself, ﷺ. All these messages were for him first, and then of course everyone else. But the way that the Prophet ﷺ was shown how to interact with those in power through the story of Musa ﷺ, through the story of one of his brothers, one of his brother prophets, in the story of Musa. And Musa ﷺ and Fir'aun are like archetypes. They're of course they're an actual story, but they're also examples or archetypes that we can draw stories from. Fir'aun is the ultimate archetype of a tyrant, of someone who appears to have all the power. In fact, he was literally enslaving the people of Musa alayhi salam. And so it would have been, we might expect a certain approach that is extremely deferential, extremely fearful. Or the other option is to be extremely aggressive. And yet the way he addressed Fir'aun, the way he was told by Allah to address Fir'aun, is to go and speak to him with gentle words. Yet those gentle words weren't differential and fearful, but rather from a place of faith and confidence, knowing full well, this is the important part, who is really in charge. When you're dealing with people in authority, you have to take this balance of knowing, of having their power and authority dwarfed in your eyes because your focal point is Allah. And when your focal point is Allah, you can address the powerful with this sense of dignity, fearlessness, but also a sense of ethics and gentle words. So you're not overly aggressive, you're not rude. I mean, if Fir'aun, the worst tyrant in history, was, Allah told Musa alayhi salam, who is far better than any of us, to speak to him with gentle words, then we should absolutely not feel that we should be aggressive and rude to someone in power, obviously. But at the same time, to not be overly differential or overly or compromise what you actually want. So to strike this beautiful Islamic prophetic balance of a sense of confidence and dignity, not born out of yourself, but born out of knowing who is truly in charge, but then to speak with the adab of a Muslim to these people. And at the same time, to address the powerless with equal humanity. This is a lesson that the Prophet ﷺ was taught in the story of Abasa. Abasa wa tawalla, the blind man who came and wanted to speak to him. Now, if you read the story in the tafsir of the surah, it's actually very interesting. The Prophet ﷺ was talking to some of the leaders of Quraysh who are very antagonistic toward Islam, and he was trying to invite them to Islam, and he knew that if they were won over, that it would make the lives of the Muslims much easier. So he was not speaking to them simply out of, any admiration for their power, but rather really a very practical goal of making life easier. And so he was addressing them, and it was a very difficult conversation. And the blind man didn't see what was going on. He didn't notice that this was happening. So he kept interrupting the Prophet ﷺ and asking him to teach him. And it kept happening. And the Prophet ﷺ, all he did was just sort of made a face that was displeased and turned away from the man because he was in the middle of something, and this was this constant interruption. And Allah Azza wa Jal used this moment to teach the Prophet and all of us that the way to deal with the powerless, people who appear to have no influence, is with this idea of equal humanity. That no one is not worth your time. This doesn't exist. If someone is interested, no matter who they are, in learning more, in understanding more, give them your time. Understand the emotional intelligence of the Prophet ﷺ. He used to turn his entire torso towards someone, whether it was a child or a servant or the ruler of a country. When he was addressing someone, he dealt with them as an equal human being. And the beautiful thing about focusing on Allah is you see the King of Kings as equal to you, because you're both equally human. And you see someone who has no power at all, who is impoverished, who has no way of hurting you, as equal to you, because you could have been in his position, and that you're no better than him. So this idea of the equal dignity of all human beings, whether they're the powerful or powerless, is essential to a Muslim leader. Number 4 is be compassionate. And this is like a whole talk by itself. The idea of being compassionate. The Prophet ﷺ was described in the Quran as a mercy to all the worlds, right? وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. a rahmah for all the worlds. If you really ponder this fact, really reflect on the fact that Allah Azza wa Jal could have described the Prophet in any way he wanted. He could have described him as a strong military leader, and of course he was. He could have described him as a teacher, and of course he was. A great father, a great husband. But to have his signature trait be a rahmah for all the worlds, and that is his main purpose for being sent. If we claim to be followers of this man, of people who are trying to emulate this man, then we have to have rahmah be our signature trait and that of our community. What does rahmah look like in a leadership role? What does that actually mean? It means you start this sense of rahmah, this rahmah that you're going to be giving the world, and apply it to yourself. Okay, that might sound a little strange, but self-compassion. What does self-compassion look like? It is very different from self-esteem. And there's a whole science of what self-compassion is. But very briefly, self-compassion means to correct yourself when you do something wrong in a way that is kind, in a way that isn't harsh and demeaning. Because when you're harsh and demeaning to yourself, you're actually helping shaitan. When you demean yourself, you are aiding shaitan against yourself. Think about this. And I remember the story of Musa alayhi salam and how Allah told him to go speak to Fir'aun in a gentle manner. All of us have a Fir'aun inside us. That is our nafs. Our nafs is a tyrant. It can be a tyrant, and we have to always check our nafs. I'll call it the ego, I'll call it the self. If we all are dealing with this little Fir'aun, then we should take the advice of the Quran and speak to it, advise it with gentle words. If we're not being harsh and demeaning to a tyrant like Fir'aun, we shouldn't do so to our own self. So check yourself and correct yourself with gentle words. But compassion always means to hold yourself accountable. It is you are oppressing yourself. The opposite of rahmah to yourself is self-oppression. Self-oppression is committing sin. Self-oppression is distancing yourself from Allah. When you allow yourself to self-indulge and stray and transgress, that is actually a form of self-oppression. So the rahmah of oneself is to check yourself, hold yourself accountable, and to do so with gentleness, so you're not helping shaitan against you. So that's the first part of rahmah. The second part is how you treat the people around you in your close circle. And that means, of course, your family. It also means your fellow executive board members, if you're on an executive board or if you're on a committee. I am stunned and disheartened sometimes by the way that we think it's okay to talk to each other, especially online. It is so devoid of rahmah. And the first element of rahmah is honesty. So don't slander each other. Don't misrepresent what someone said to you. Don't spread a rumor about someone. Treat each other with the compassion that should be our signature trait. And that's the only way we will build strong institutions, strong communities, strong families, is to make rahmah the foundation of those interactions. And these things are sometimes very small. If you read in the Sunnah, the amount of teachings about this idea of emotional intelligence, when you read about things like that it is wrong for two people to whisper if there's a third person who's not included, something that seemingly trivial is actually a teaching of the Sunnah. That a smile is a charity, that you shouldn't hold a grudge for 3 days, that you're even allowed to tell some white lies to make peace between each other. This is how important our interactions, our social interactions are, because these are the tendons that hold our community together. We are always talking about unity, and we talk about it in these grand terms when it actually comes down to these micro interactions. Put a goal for yourself that your micro interactions will be acts of micro compassion rather than microaggression. So be compassionate. Number 5, be an anti-racist. This is such an important topic, and it's an entire talk. But when you read the Sunnah, the Prophet ﷺ was not simply not racist. He was an anti-racist by the definition we have today. What does that mean? He did very specific actions and took very specific decisions to counter and correct the problem of racism in his society. And so some very, simple examples. First, when he opened Mecca, Mecca was it was a society of hierarchy. And the hierarchy was based on your lineage, right? Your blood, your clan, your tribe. And so about the most racist society you can imagine. Why did he ask Bilal radiallahu anhu to stand on top of the Kaaba to make adhan? It's not like people tell the story like, oh, well, he had a beautiful voice. And so that's the only reason. That's it. That's the one and only reason he was chosen to do that. Why did he have to stand on the Kaaba to do it? He could have stood anywhere. But these deliberate decisions on the part of the Prophet ﷺ to break a social order, to shake a social order whose foundation is racism. He was doing things to counter and break racism rather than just simply not being racist himself. Another very simple example is Osama bin Zayd, radiallahu anhu. Now, a lot of times we learn, right, in the Sirah that he was only 17 years old when he was put as a general, commanding an army that had Qurayshi nobility in it. And we're always, at least the way I learned the Sirah, I was like, whoa, he was only 17. That's so amazing. But the other thing that we don't learn is that his mother was of African descent and his father was a former slave. Now, his mother was a free woman, but his father used to be a slave. He was actually the Prophet's slave before he freed him. So and he was a non-Arab. So you have this 17-year-old whose background are two parents that are, in that society were people who the social order devalued. And why? So putting him as the head of the army to tell all these Qurayshi nobility what to do and whose lives depend on his orders is a very deliberate act of anti-racism. And so it is not enough to not be racist. And I think this is incredibly important, and to read the Sirah from this lens of how all the ways that the Prophet ﷺ did things deliberately to break a social order that was unjust and contrary to the teachings of Islam. Now, I also want to mention this in the way that we define success. So sometimes I will be asked this question in talks. And so here's how the question is phrased. How can we learn as Muslims, like as a Muslim community, how can we learn from the lessons of the Polish people, the Irish people, and the Italians? And, how they were at first discriminated against, and then they were sort of accepted. And so it seems like a very, what's the word? It seems like a very harmless question, right? Benign question. But when you kind of dig into it a little, the assumption of what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to emulate these communities is revealing how we're defining success in this situation. So what are we doing there? What happened with the Irish, the Poles, and the Italian? Well, what happened to them is they became white, right? They weren't white when they came in. They were defined as something other than white. Then they were absorbed into whiteness. And so they didn't challenge the racial hierarchy in America. They simply ascended it. And so that's what we're trying to do. Let's just ascend the racial hierarchy. That is not what the Prophet did. That is not the way of the Prophet. He didn't want to ascend a tribal hierarchy. He wanted to destructure it. He wanted to rebuild it in a way that was in line with Islamic justice principles. So, how are we defining success? It cannot be to simply be accepted into a flawed racial hierarchy. And first of all, even if that were, it's not only an immoral, incorrect definition of success, it's also impossible. It's not going to happen, right? The vast majority of Muslims are people of color, whatever they are. Only a minority would ever be white passing. So it's not going to happen anyway. But it shouldn't even be the goal. The goal cannot be to ascend an unjust racial hierarchy in terms of the way we define success for the Muslim community in America. It must be to challenge that hierarchy. If you think about the Prophet, who was the Prophet? He had the most noble blood you can even imagine. Now, he also had the experience of being a member of a vulnerable community because he was an orphan. But who was his father? Who was his grandfather? He was from the most noble tribe and the most noble clan of the most noble tribe. So in terms of the tribal hierarchy, he was at the top. He was at the top of this system of asabiya, of tribalism. But rather than enjoy that privilege, which he could have, and he was offered even more, he did the opposite. He brought a message that dismantled this unjust hierarchy and rebuild a new one. Whereas what are we trying to do? Sometimes I think we're trying to compromise this system of justice to ascend an unjust hierarchy. And so it's very important that we check this idea of what does success look like when we talk about being an anti-racist. So I only went through 5 of the 10 and it's already 1:30. So I was told I can go over a little bit. So I will take a few more minutes just to kind of at least go through the rest in some fashion. So number 6 is build coalitions. What I mean by that is this: don't try to do everything by yourself. Build coalitions that are principled, that are based on a common goal, rather than a coalition where everyone's the same. You're never going to build coalitions with people who agree with us on everything. But we should balance the idea of having a common goal while working for that goal and not having to compromise our ethics and principles to be in that coalition. If the price of entry into a coalition is compromising our principles, that is not a coalition. That is being co-opted. At the same time, we can't expect total conformity to build coalitions. Now, remember, when you look at how Mecca was opened, when the Prophet ﷺ conquered Mecca and it was bloodless, right? Because he brought 10,000 men. And if you read about it in the Sirah, it was like the Meccans were so overwhelmed, they just surrendered because of the sheer might of this army that the Prophet ﷺ had assembled. Many of those people who came to an alliance with the Muslims were not Muslim themselves. So this was a coalition of people who made the opening of Mecca possible, and not all of them had converted to Islam. So that is this principle of being able to work with people who are not like us for a common goal while not compromising is one that is borne out in the Sirah. It's very important. And the reason I also want to mention it is because our adversaries, people who want us to be marginalized, one of their goals is to make us feel isolated, is to make us feel like we have no allies, is to make us feel small in number and weak. So it's important that we not succumb to that line of thinking. 7 is relinquish personal vendettas for the bigger cause. Now, the Prophet, ﷺ, when he opened Mecca, he came in, imagine this is you, right? He left Mecca as a wanted, as someone with 100 camels on as the prize for his head, right? He was being hunted down. He was being pursued for execution. They tried to assassinate him. That is how he left. Those are the circumstances by which he left. And then these same people waged war against his community, tried to annihilate his community, went into his own city and made alliances with people in the city to try to assassinate the Prophet. So these were people who he had every right to want to seek revenge against, and no one would blame him. And he came back to conquer the city and open it for dawah with 10,000 men. Okay, this massive army, especially in those days, it was huge, unheard of, especially in Arabia, where the skirmishes between tribes were small. So he had the motive and the means to seek revenge, and they had done things to him that were deeply hurtful, especially taking from him the dearest people to him, starting with Khadija, by the way, because she died as a consequence of the circumstances in the boycott. Then of course, his uncle Hamza and so forth, radiallahu anhum. So he had every personal reason, every political reason, and every other reason to want to be justified in seeking revenge, and yet he didn't. He did the opposite and granted people clemency. So to relinquish personal vendettas for the bigger cause, don't make this about your ego or about yourself. Think of what is important in the bigger picture. Don't run your life and your organizations in a way that is petty, where you're just trying to don't have an axe to grind against an individual. Keep your eyes on the actual prize. Number 8 is really important. Decide on a process for making a decision, whether it's a vote, shura, and then a decision by the emir or the amira. Whatever the process is, decide on it ahead of time. And then the outcome of that process, even if it's against your preference, go with it. That is the decision of the process. That is the outcome of the process. Don't renege. Don't go back on that. When that decision is made, go forth, be decisive, and execute it with every piece of energy and sincerity in your heart. It's very dysfunctional when I see in many organizations, and not just MSA, but full-grown adults, where the process, the outcome of any process, whether it's a vote or a research, a fact-finding mission or whatever, comes out with a result. This is what we should do, and the head of the organization doesn't like the outcome, so they either cause fitna and says, no, I don't, so I don't want this, or something was wrong with the process that they didn't mention before, right? And they divide the community in half, or they leave and they start their own organization. This is not how unity works, and this is not how leadership works. The Prophet ﷺ, in the case of the Battle of Uhud, the outcome of the shura was that they leave the city and they go fight outside. That was not his preference. He wanted to stay inside the city and defend it from within, but he went along with the consensus of the group to model this principle for leaders later, that they have to listen to the people and they have to go along with the outcome of a process that they agreed on. Number 9, really important also, is avoid accusations without evidence. This always blows my mind that the Prophet ﷺ actually knew who the hypocrites were, right? He actually knew because Allah told him. And yet he never called them out, you're a hypocrite, you're a hypocrite, you're a hypocrite, and got them basically executed. He didn't do this kind of thing where he was accusing people of what was in their heart without evidence. And it was amazing because he knew he had that knowledge as the prophet, والسلام, he knew. And he knew they were plotting against him. Why do you think he left them? Doesn't that sort of, I mean, that question should be a question that we ponder and reflect on. It is one of the reasons is to show future leaders that you can't go out on a witch hunt and decide because of a hunch what's in someone's heart and make accusations against them without evidence. This is crucial. Due process in anything you're doing is essential, because this is such a source of fitna when you start throwing out accusations. And this is also a way of slandering someone. If you don't have actual evidence, don't make accusations. And then I'll end with this. Choose the akhirah every time. And I say this, the story it was the entire life of the Prophet, where his akhirah was his focal point. The one that I'll mention, though, is when he was actually given a choice, an actual choice between ruling on earth forever and his death and meeting Allah. And he chose Allah. He chose his death, and he chose to meet Allah sooner. And I say this because it's not only it has a deep, it has a bigger meaning than just, of course, none of us are going to have a choice like that, right? Obviously, but we do in a different way, in that what he did is he chose Allah over worldly power. And that has to be our choice every single time. The way that would manifest in our lives is if you are facing an ethical dilemma where fudging a little rule here or there, compromising on some ethics here or there will the end will justify the means, and things will be so much better for the community. This idea of rationalizing an incorrect process because you think the end is going to be good is something you have to avoid with vigilance, because it is so easy. It is so easy to fall into that. Choose the akhirah every single time. Wa jazakallahu khairan. Thank you so much for listening to this, and I hope it was beneficial to your leadership journey. Wassalamu alaikum.